Statistics indicate around the world that 43% of women are involved in agriculture. This is actually why today we will be looking at the place of women in agriculture. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
On a day like this.
Thank you.
Talk to us about Seeds.
Seeds is a for-profit organization, but it is a social impact organization, which means that the work that we do is solving some of the society's issues, but also making profit for us. So what we do as Seeds is actually to support women in agriculture along the value chains of agriculture, and we do that through agri-financing. So we support women who are at the processing end of agriculture. So women who basically, provide services like cassava, gari. This is because one of the crops that we started with was cassava. Okay. So we work around women who provide that, but we've also moved now to basically just supporting women who are at the processing end of the agri value chain. If I would also ask, why agriculture? So what we saw at the beginning was if you take a look into research, you find that a lot of women actually work in the agri value chain, but they work at the bottom of the value chain, right? So you find that a lot of women are either selling fruits or trying to make gari at home to sell. One of the communities that we work with, we actually saw women trying to make cassava flour even at home. So we found that women, first of all, that's a sector that women play a lot in, but there's not a lot of support that goes into that. And another thing that we actually saw was during the COVID, we saw how a lot of women lost their income because fruits and vegetables could not move. A lot of people were losing income at the time. So my co-founder and I sat down to say, what can we do to support more women in this sector? And that's how Seeds was born, actually. Okay. Yeah.
Now, looking at the parameter within which Seeds was born, I am so curious. Is there hope, as it were, for the rural woman out there who, to a large extent, if you look at what she sells, at the end of the day, you wonder how she makes ends meet?
I think that's the very interesting part of it, which is why we kind of focused on the business of agriculture, not necessarily agriculture in itself. So even the women that we work with, beyond just saying, oh, you're in the agri space, we actually take financial literacy trainings to them. We take more trainings on how to, do better in their processes to them as well. We believe that if we're able to move from the mindset of a minor agriculture to actually looking at agriculture as a business, then there's definitely hope for these women to move up, the ladder, do better, make more money, beyond just making money for their households, but then beyond now being able to make money for themselves to do other things as well. So there is hope.
All right. So much is happening in the world today, and I find this very curious. Please, I want you to further emphasize on agriculture as a business.
So when we talk about agriculture, most times people just look at agriculture as farming. It's either you're farming crops or you're farming animals somehow, but that's where everybody thinks of agriculture. But there's an entire value chain to it. There's the logistics part of it. There's the business of bringing the inputs to the farms. There's the business of taking the produce out of the farms. That's right. There's the business of the processing. There's the business of the support of the processing. There's the business of the packaging. There's the business of linkages and getting these products into stores and into shops. There's so much that we don't see when we see agriculture. So when you begin to move people's minds away from just looking at agriculture as farming or just, when you talk about crops and animals, that's when you understand that there is indeed a business. And what we saw is in the line of work that we did when we were trying to support women end to end, the logistics part of agriculture is one of the hardest parts, but if you can get it right, there's a lot of money in that area. When
I look at this kind of efforts, I tend to think, is this all about enhancing the entrepreneurial strength of the woman, or are we ultimately looking at probably even contributing to the GDP someday?
That's a very fantastic question, actually, because if you improve the entrepreneurial strength of women and they become better business women, then they will add to the GDP. Right? Because they begin to make more money, and they're not just making money to spend at home now. They're beginning to make more money that goes into the system. So of course they're buying products, they're buying all other things, right? And it's literally a cycle. So we see that the more that we can influence that for women and help them to see and make better business decisions, then at the end of the day, the entire country is going to benefit from it.
Well, we're looking at the prospects of enhancing the agri-business targeting women. Now, when it comes to storage, how wide can you say your target is when it comes to training these women?
I think that one of the major problems that we saw, at the beginning was this processing issue. And that's why we thought that it was very important to play in that part, because we saw a lot of food wastage. And so what we've done is try to encourage women at the processing end of it. Okay. So any woman who is in the processing end of business, so it could be people who are processing to cassava flour, yam flour, potato flour, whatever. But we've seen that that's where most of the issues come from, because it's easy to go, I won't say it's easy, but it's relatively easy to start farming, right? Yeah. And then you produce, and then there's nobody who is buying these things from you, because there's hardly markets, right? And even when there's markets, sometimes because of middle players, you're not getting as much for what you should be getting, for your produce. So we found that it will be a great way to support women in agriculture if we focus on the processing end. So while this may not be as good as it should be right now, but there is hope. Because, we've also seen in the line of our work, we've also seen that there are a lot of locally made processing equipment that are being used. So you don't have to wait to import anything from China anymore.
That's right.
So women are able to start, this processing business fairly easier than before. I think another thing that we've seen that is helping this value chain is there are now places that NAFDAC certifies, so you don't have to have a full-on factory by yourself. Okay. There are places where you can go and they process for you. So NAFDAC certifies it as a processing plant, and then people have, their timeline, their time slot where they can go for their own processing. So I, as a woman, I can go to the market and buy plantain and then take it to that processing, pay per kg to process, I package and I go and sell. So there are ways around these things, but I think that there's a lot of improvement ongoing in the processing end of it.
Our focus really is on women. Yeah. Do you, to any extent, see in the nearest future, probably in our lifetime, the possibility of food sustainability as far as Nigeria is concerned? Probably the West African sub-region and Africa.
I think, sadly, especially here in Nigeria, especially because of the Boko Haram thing and, the herdsmen issues, I know personally a lot of, people are not farming as much as they are. And while maybe we may not be seeing it here right now, but it is coming. Last year, also the flood that we had in Nigeria was a major thing. We know of big organizations that lost, several hectares of farmland. But while that is happening, there are also other organizations that are beginning to come up with sustainable methods and sustainable ways of farming. So I think that I think we've used the word hope a lot of times in this conversation, but there is hope because I find that there are more there are more newer methods of farming, indoor farming. There are other things that are coming up now that can help us get towards sustainability, and also better improved technologies that are coming to support farming and the way that farming is done. So
when it comes to catch them young, what comes to mind? Do you have a place for those caliber of persons? When I talk about that, I mean our children, probably in schools. Can we begin to make the girl child see the need for sustainability down the road through agribusiness?
So, it's something that we've thought of, but as seeds, we have thought of, but we've not started anything in that area.
Direction.
But I do know that there are some organizations that are doing that, especially NGOs, that are beginning to say, look, farming is more than just planting seeds. There's more to farming. So there are interventions that are ongoing. And kudos to organizations that are doing that. Personally, every day I come out of my house and I'm like, oh my God, I wish I had a land space to actually do some farming. Because when I grew up, we had a backyard where my mom planted literally everything. So you could go there and pluck plantains when it's in season. You can pick tomatoes and all of that. I learned how to cook with a milk container and stones outside because I was taking vegetables from the back of the house. So I'm hopeful that we will eventually get there again. I hope that we get there.
As we prepare to round up, I want you to give us an insight into what agribusiness simply typifies.
So agribusiness is simply the business of agriculture. That's what it is. And just like we said before, I think it's time for us to move away from agriculture of just thinking of just agriculture as farming of plants and animals.
That's right.
There's an entire, and every crop has a value chain. Every crop. So don't look at it as, oh, if I don't have a farmland or if I'm not rearing chickens, then I'm not doing agriculture. Look at the entire value chain. And I'll give an example. And I'll talk about cassava because that's what we farm, so we know that really well. There's the part of it that has to go into getting your inputs to the farms. There's the part of it that provides best practice trainings for farmers.
That's right.
There's the actual farming itself, putting it in the ground, right? There's the monitoring of it, right? Then there's the logistics when it's ready that takes it from there to the processing, right?
That's right.
Then you now talk about the different types of processing and the different things that can come out from cassava.
That's right.
When you think of those ones, you can actually now think of an entire value chain from that as well. That's where the business comes in. So it's not necessarily in just the things that we think about.
That's right.
And I think it's time that we as Nigerians actually begin to look more into the business of agriculture than agriculture itself.
All right. You know, entrepreneurship, as it were, is one word that really came on our lexicon, I think about 20, 25 years ago. Are we, to a large extent, seeing any improvement as far as our daily lives are concerned because of the need for us to see the business angle to everything, instead of just thinking it begins with farming animals and what have you, and plants?
I think there is, and entrepreneurship has helped because you find that now a lot of things that we are beginning to produce as processed foods have improved. So, I mean, I came across eggplant flour. I came across sweet potato flour. I've come across rice flour. These are things that not in the years before, people were not necessarily looking at it at that. But now people are beginning to see, oh, I can literally turn, there's cabbage flour, there's cauliflower flour, right? So I think that it's beginning, our minds, because of the whole entrepreneurship thing that has come, people's minds are beginning to open and they're more innovative in the way that they think about food and even in the way that they think about the processing of the things that we have. There's tomato flour. Like there's almost, you can turn almost anything to flour and with that you've increased the shelf life, right? So I think that, yes, entrepreneurship has helped, even though there are still a lot of people who are still running traditional businesses and not necessarily entrepreneurial in the way that they do their things. But for the ones who are actually entrepreneurs, we've seen a lot of innovation that has come, you know, just by being exposed to some of the things that come with entrepreneurship.
Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for expertise. Thanks for sharing this level of information with us.
Thank you.